But it's
I
not.
could have gotten away with more probably
You
if
get
I
the screen
were
recording.
like secondary suite carrying
It's so hard. I haven't tested it, but I've got the check for the microphone set.
Yeah.
I guess
You see levels, I still think it's pretty good.
three bags is definitely significantly more cumbersome to carry around.
主要是吧，你想法不成熟，也能看出来，该是走。
Is that this is got the microphone set.
Yeah, but I don't really have time to meet.
睡着了。
Okay. I'd say if it's not gonna be enough to share for 100, like, probably not. But yeah, I mean, like, how much you might something like that.
Looks like the network is decent.
Okay, while we wait for a couple more people to assemble, we can all appreciate many different faces of the SourceCred logo. Unlike most logos, the SourceCred logo is in fact an algorithmically generated logo. So depending on the parameters you give it, all of these different logo possibilities could be yours. Some of them are really quite nifty, like once you start to get spiral patterns, a lot of experimentation. Carefully choosing the space of logos. And I imagine I'll give it until maybe like 4 or 6 to start. Feel like people are still trying. Yes, this is our start. We started in 2 minutes after the discussion. So how many people here are working on DAOs? How many of you are bothered by the problem of how to distribute tokens within DAOs? Okay, only like, so okay, the people who are working on DAOs but are not concerned about token distribution, what are you doing?
We standardize it to like a fixed rate.
Fixed rate?
It's a fixed rate of 20 DAI in one DAO token, where the DAO token gets value over time, and the fixed DAI is fixed for the payout. That's the reputation. We have a fixed sheet of like different tasks that you can do, and then you fill in all the things that you did, and then.
Interesting.
So it seems to work so far.
Are you worried about the problem where people like what if you know you're giving a certain number of tokens for a commit, say? How do you deal with the fact that some commits are like really important and some commits just like fixed typos or what have you?
We have so we're doing DAO events with DAOfest, and we have a post-event report, which up until this point we did like 30, 35 events, and it covers most of the like. If you have a picture and a description and but maybe a task that's quite hard to gamify because there's like so many checkpoints that you can check, and you need to submit the numbers and the videos and the presentation slides, and like it's not really worth to fake it. Because the pay is still quite low. So for 20 DAI an hour, like 10 hours, you're not gonna do all the work to fake it. Like.
Interesting. Okay, that's not bad.
But it's simplest. It's in the simplicity that makes it work. Another DAO isn't part of it still. So please enlighten me.
But we gave a lot of thought to this idea of like paying per unit of work in the process of coming up with this website. And I see the room is filling up a little bit more. I'm going to give a couple more minutes for people to filter in. I'm going to let Dan come as part of the presentation. Is anyone else here distributing tokens in DAOs to contributors? What are you doing?
It sucks compared to source credit, that's for sure. It's totally subjective. We basically have a praise bot where people do stuff, and the people who see that stuff was done and have the ability to make praise, then they just say, hey, this guy did this. And then once a month, we go through and look at all the praise that was dished and just assign, we have 4 people have a spreadsheet down and we just vote on
Interesting.
how many, everyone even has their own point scoring themselves, you know, and we just normalize it and say, okay, this person did these things that were praised. The 4 people that have this subjective power, you know, gave them a total of 3% of the total tokens that we're distributing this month. So then we also vote on how many tokens are distributed that month, and then they get a number. And then we manually send them tokens. Because we're using an Argon DAO, and we haven't figured out how to hack the multi-cent yet, but next month.
How's that system working for you?
It's fine, it won't scale. But it's fine, like, for a small, non-value token, in
Right.
a way, its reputation. No, it works fine. It's a calculated thing considering our resources.
Right. And then there's the classic approach is just don't give the tokens at all, or only to miners as opposed to contributors. Yes.
And also issue my own DAO token.
Mhm.
Basically, it's running on the Ethereum testnet, but we also put the real digital asset with something like a Uniswap, and people can trading with them. And I will reward those people, those smart engineers who help me build my GitHub repo. I will reward them my token, but it's quite subjective. And I also make a Telegram bot. People can translation and make a red packet, and even they can play dice with them within a Telegram group.
Interesting. Cool. Okay, it's 4:09. I feel like we've got a large enough group here. Maybe we'll someone could just like leave that door like maybe even just barely open so people can still come in, but kind of reduce the noise, and we'll get started. I'm going to set up talk for myself. Cool. So, I won't forget to record. Cool. I'm Dandelion. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the TBD, or temporary benevolent dictator of SourceCred. It's very important that your benevolent dictators be temporary, otherwise they might prove instead to be temporarily benevolent. And I'm here to talk to you about SourceCred. So SourceCred is a couple different things. On the one hand, it's a social algorithm that is trying to figure out how to assign cred to contributors in a project in a way that is both neutral and scalable. Second, it's a cryptoeconomic system that is about both governing the cred instance and governing the project that is using cred in a way that creates incentives for rational actors to want to sponsor those projects. And third, it's a cred experiment, which is to say it's a live dog fooding system that is developing SourceCred itself. So I'm going to talk a bit about SourceCred's origins. So essentially, back in early 2018, I was working at Google in their machine learning group, which sounds really cool, but after a couple of years, it actually become quite boring. And I was doing open source maintenance, just kind of like seeing GitHub issues, like, maybe I'll fix this one, maybe I'll fix that one. But mostly I was reading crypto white papers and just thinking, why am I not doing the stuff that I'm actually really excited by? So I went to hang out with my friend Huang, who is also the CEO and founder of Protocol Labs. Yeah. So we got to talking about this problem that he sees, which is Protocol Labs is sponsoring a lot of projects, like IPFS, like libp2p, and then these projects, of course, have got tons of dependencies. It's just part of the whole open source ecosystem. And at the same time, Protocol Labs is making cryptocurrencies. And so he really wants to be able to give those cryptos directly to the open source communities that sustain his company's work. It would both be a sound business decision, because then those projects would be thriving more effectively with less overhead for Protocol Labs, And it would also be clearly the right thing to do. Like if someone is working for free on Go or on libp2p or on Node, why wouldn't they get some of the value that cryptocurrencies are able to create? So we got to thinking, what if we just sent cryptocurrencies to everyone in the open source ecosystem? And the issue you quickly realize is figuring out how to do this in a fair way at scale. So once you're at a community the size of IPFS, thousands of contributors, you can't just know subjectively who did what anymore. So maybe you think of using counters, maybe you'll pay per commit, maybe you'll pay per line of code, maybe you're gonna pay per code review, and you run into a problem that this is all really gameable. And I think this is actually fundamental to using the approach of a counter, because if you're paying for a pull request, there's so much variety in pull requests between ones that were really complicated, really valuable, enabled a lot, or ones that just fixed a typo, or maybe started some work that never got finished, and those pull requests don't add very much value. So it seemed like we just needed a fundamentally different approach. And this was the starting point for CRED, trying to come up with the algorithm that could solve this problem. So I have for a long time been fascinated by the PageRank algorithm. You may have heard of PageRank. It was named kind of partly because it was used to rank web pages by Google, and partly after one of its creators, Larry Page. It really was the starting point. After publishing the PageRank paper in 1998, Larry and Sergey left Stanford to found Google. And the core idea is basically that we'll give a score to a web page based on the scores of the web pages that link to it. So in this example, we can imagine that B is some web page that everyone links to. Maybe it's Wikipedia. And then maybe these small little nodes here, all these teal ones at the bottom, maybe they're actually kind of like spammy web pages. No one is linking to them. And so maybe here someone is trying to game the system so that E will get a lot of score. But it doesn't really work very well because these small web pages don't have very much score to give. So it's got a little bit of Sybil resistance, and it kind of embeds the idea that context matters, the structure of the network matters. And I think these transitive reputation style algorithms are really interesting. And I got to thinking, what if we could use this to value the contributions to an open source project? So what if we think about the work that goes into making a feature? Maybe that feature was proposed in a forum post, and that forum post was inspired by an in-person conversation. Maybe that feature was implemented by a pull request, and there was someone who authored that pull request and another person who reviewed it. Then if that feature was valuable, if that feature was worth cred, then we could flow this cred along the whole structure of the graph. And now we're out of the problem of dealing with counters, because we're not saying, oh, every pull request gets 5 cred. We're saying a pull request that was implementing a feature we really care about can get a lot of cred. The pull request that just fixes a typo, or the pull request that never gets merged, won't be embedded in the same way in the graph, and so it won't get as much cred. Now, the first thing that people always ask is, won't PageRank also get gamed? And if you asked me this in 2018, when I was starting SourceCred, I would have said, well, it could get gamed a little bit, but PageRank is actually pretty resilient. It's got this nice Sybil robustness property because stuff that's from an attacker won't actually have cred to begin with. And having worked on this for 2 years, I can now tell you, yeah, PageRank is actually hella good. It's surprising and in some ways uncanny how easy it is to create weird little graphs in PageRank. So for example, if I were to go and make a user and I get I write one post that people like, and then I never like anything myself, maybe it'll become a sort of black hole of cred and just accumulate it from across the project. So that's concerning, but I think in a way it's also unsurprising. The idea that we're going to create a social system that is impossible to game, which is to say a social system that's somehow I have God perfect, always gives everyone their just desserts, is I think a little bit unrealistic. And if we look at all of the social systems that exist in the world, whether they're the social system of becoming popular at a school, or the social system of getting elected to an office, or the social system of getting promoted in a corporation, these are always getting gamed, Whether, for example, someone who doesn't do a lot of work, but is just really good at seeming important in meetings. That's a form of gaming, and a lot of people have careers built on that style of gaming. But I think what this tells us is that for a social system to be viable, it doesn't need to be somehow perfectly immune to gaming. It just needs to be robust. And we know that PageRank can be made robust because Google is using it as at scale for searching the web. So we can ask, what is Google doing? And I think it really comes down to cat and mouse dynamics. You basically have got all of these mice who are attacking your system. They're trying to figure out how to get their spam, Viagra, pill website to be boosted to the top of your search result. They're trying to get way too much cred for their posts that were actually all not adding any value. And so what Google does is they basically have one single massive centralized cat. It's the one cat to rule them all. And they've got their team of research scientists in their headquarters, and they're operating this centralized and opaque algorithm that no one can see. They're changing it without explaining what they're changing, based on new people coming up with new ways to game it. And hopefully they're doing these changes to mitigate gaming. Maybe sometimes they're doing changes just to boost their own property search results. It's hard to tell. And this is another one of the problems of trusting an opaque centralized entity. And if you think about it from a computer security standpoint, it really is security through obscurity. So they are hoping that their system will stay secure so long as no one actually knows how it works. Now, SourceCred is taking a different approach. We simply can't use Google's approach because as an open source project, it needs to be transparent. It needs to be verifiable. It needs to be something that everyone can tweak. So instead, we're focusing on the project level. We think that moderating PageRank on the scale of the entire internet is really hard because you have no idea what anything is. It's just too big to keep track of. But if we're in a particular project working together, and all the core contributors have been working together for months or years, and they see someone shooting up the cred ranking without doing any actual work, well, they probably have stuff like a community consensus, like a kind of social ties and cohesion that allow them to intervene both at the algorithm level, but also at the social level, saying, hey, please stop gaming this algorithm. But since it's open source, anyone can fork and improve it. Every project can fully configure their own instance. So if they're finding a way they're getting gamed, they can tweak their settings. And also, if the cred is just being handled kind of unfairly, maybe they have a now newly evil dictator who's just giving themselves all the cred, then anyone could fork that cred instance and persuade the community to switch to a different version. So if Google is one cat to rule them all, SourceCred is more like one cat for every community. Now, I want to touch a little bit more on this idea of gaming being a form of incentive vulnerability. Because I think that's really what it is. Every time someone finds a really effective way to game, it's because they've found a hole in the system where its ability to distinguish between value and activity has broken down. And we know a lot about patching vulnerabilities in software. We have things like responsible disclosure and then bounties. So we encourage people to report vulnerabilities rather than exploit them. And then because anyone can patch the system, you get the sort of eyes of the crowd all working to improve it. And what we've learned is that these open source systems wind up producing much more secure software, oftentimes, than the centralized opaque ones, because you have everyone able to review it, look for problems, and improve it. So going back to cred a bit, we've got these scores, these cred scores, and a cred score, first I want to note, all cred is specific to individual projects. So it's not like there's some global cred out there that's telling you what your worth is in the eyes of the machine. And I think that's both a good thing, because I think that'd be fairly dystopian. If you want to look at there's a Black Mirror episode called Nosedive that features a world where people are constantly rating each other, and it's just super dark. And I think part of what made it so dark is that there's a single global score, and no one can opt out of that system, and no one can make a different system with different values. But the other thing is that we just don't know how to govern a global system. You'd wind up having these issues with people gaming PageRank again. So that's why cred is always specific to a particular community. And cred scores are applying both to people. So I've got a certain cred score within SourceCred, and we'll look at that later. But it also applies at the level of contribution. So every pull request has a cred score, every issue has a cred score, every forum post, or even work that doesn't happen on the computer at all can have cred scores. And because of this, because it's tied to specific contributions, because it's retroactively updating, maybe you did some work last year that no one really realized was important, and then this year everyone started building on it, then your cred goes up because now your work is being realized as important. It winds up being a lot more like reputation than like a token. But if you remember going back to our original vision of being able to flow economic value across the open source dependency graph, we've built tools for flowing value, and those tools are tokens. So we kind of need to figure out a way to hook this reputation score from SourceCred into the whole set of crypto-economic primitives getting built by the Ethereum community. That brings us to Grain, a cred-based token. The properties of Grain, first is that it's issued based on cred. The way we are handling this in the SourceCred community is every week we mint 15,000 cred, and then we distribute, 15,000 Grain, and we distribute it to people with cred. Just like cred, it's a totally project-specific thing. There's no like universal Grain ICO happening, just make your own token. And Grain represents proof of support. I'll explain in a bit what that means.
What's the difference between Grain and cred?
Yeah, so cred is a sort of reputation score. Like you have cred and you can't sell it, you can't transfer it, it's just tied to your identity and the work that you've done. But then because you have cred, projects will give you Grain. And Grain is a token. Think of it as an ERC20 token. And then so you can just freely sell it to sponsors of the project, you can use it for your own purposes. It's something that you own, as opposed to something that the project kind of attributes to you. And then Grain does give the ability to influence cred. So first we'll talk about issuance. We basically mint and then distribute Grain to people who have cred. Some of the Grain goes to people who have recent cred. So for example, if you go and do some work in SourceCred this week, you'll get some amount of Grain from SourceCred, just like immediately, fast feedback. But more of the Grain is minted over time to lifetime cred. So the idea here is that on the one hand, we want to make long-term alignment. So we want it to be the case, not that like, we don't want people to be singing for their supper where it feels like every week like, oh, I need to like show up this week, I can't take a vacation, otherwise my like Grain income is all going to disappear. We want it to be more like someone who contributes to the project over a long time and who adds a lot of demonstrated value. We'll start to see sort of royalty payments coming from the project in the form of Grain.
What's the function? Like how do you determine how much?
So that's something that every project can choose. Right now we are sending 20% of SourceCred Grain based on just the most recent scores, and 80% based on lifetime scores. The other really nice thing about paying based on lifetime scores is that it means that, let's say for example, that you went and made some contributions to SourceCred this week, and we just like didn't really get it. You were like a step ahead. And so nobody liked your stuff very much, nobody engaged, nobody built on it. And so you didn't get very much Grain payment. Or maybe even the algorithm was just like kind of missing your kind of signal. And then 6 months from now, we realize that your work was really important, and so its cred goes up. Then these lifetime cred payments are going to say, you were underpaid 6 months ago, because we now see that your contributions were worth a lot of cred and you weren't given a lot of Grain. So now we'll bump you up. We'll kind of make you whole for getting undervalued in the past. And I think this is really nice because it means that contributors don't need to worry about every week like watching out to make sure that they got enough cred for their work,
So,
provided that the system catches up.
so the cred is like a PageRank for GitHub users?
Not just GitHub, but yeah, cred is like a score from PageRank for work that you do on GitHub, or maybe posts you make on Discourse, or really any other source of data that you want. SourceCred is built around a plugin system. So we've written plugins for GitHub and Discourse, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. But in principle, pretty much any kind of work could be included in the graph. So, you've got this Grain. I think one question that anyone who's issuing a token should have a good answer to is, what does this token represent? What meaningful information about the world is encoded in this token? And if the answer for this is, well, this token represents people who gave us money during the ICO, and it's like, is that actually like a useful thing for your system to be tracking? Do the people who gave you money 3 years ago actually like deserve something special? Or is it some other category that this is a weak approximator for? And this is why I have a lot of skepticism about a lot of ICOs, because I don't think they have a good answer for the question of what does this token mean? But in Grain, I can tell you exactly what it means. Grain means that someone has supported a project. Anyone who has SourceCred Grain got it in one of two ways. Either the path of the contributor, they went and made valuable contributions to SourceCred. Those contributions were picked up and added to the cred graph, and then we issued Grain to them. Or the path of the sponsor, they bought that token from someone else, which means that they were paying someone, they were giving money to someone who was a contributor. Or transitively, they bought it from another supporter, another sponsor. But so that means that now when I look at the grain balance for source credit, it's actually telling me something about, yeah, these are the people who should have special privileges in the project because they showed up and supported it in some material way. And I think these are the two groups that you really need for a healthy project. You need some people who are doing work, and you need some way of paying them. So this gets us to the really interesting mechanism for grain. Because so far, we've got a story where grain gets issued, it like appears, it goes to contributors. And I think that the token, since we're constantly giving more grain to people, we need some story of how we're constantly removing grain from the system too. Otherwise, it's just this totally inflationary mess, and it's not actually going to accrue value. So the thing you can do with grain is boost things. When you boost a contribution, you're permanently locking up your grain. That contribution is getting more cred. You're actually minting new cred that's going to flow from that contribution to related work. And you are getting a slice of the future cred to that contribution. This is a surprisingly powerful mechanism. Let's explore the things you can do with it. So the first thing that a booster can do is choose priorities for the project. And I'm actually at this point going to tell a little story about my work at Google on an open source project. So I was working on TensorBoard, which is a data visualization system for TensorFlow, Google's like premier machine learning system. And I would every day get all of these GitHub issues coming in, maybe like 1 to 2 GitHub issues a day. And some of them would just be asking for features. Can you please implement this plugin? Can you please accommodate this form of data? And I'm gonna be honest with you, I was not particularly motivated to solve feature requests that came in through GitHub. It's like, cool, you asked me to do work for free. Google is paying me to do Google's priorities. Google kind of wants you to be happy, but like only kind of, like it's not the most important thing. So if you have a very easy issue, maybe I'll like do it for you. Or if you have an issue that affects everyone, I'll probably do it for you. But if it's just something that's like important to you, it's like, sorry, like here's how you would do it yourself if you had the time. And one day a feature request came in that was very different. It was also requiring me to make a material change to the program, and it would have been a lot of work. It was to make it so that TensorBoard could support super private like medical data, because this was coming from a group that wanted to use TensorFlow for like radiology scans. And unlike all of my other feature requests, I dropped everything and like solved this super quick. I had it done within a week. And the reason for that was that this came from within Google and came from a super important and politically well-connected team within Google. And so I knew, oh, okay, if I fix this, that's gonna get me promoted. So yeah, I will prioritize your issue, certainly. And I think this reveals an interesting economic reality for open source, which is that open source really matters. It like enables things like whether you're going to do these medical like machine learning models that allow you to diagnose cancer, but mostly there's not any way to actually communicate incentives. If that exact same group had been outside of Google with as much money, as much resources, and they wanted to motivate me to take care of their issue, there's not a good way for me to pay, not a good way for them to pay me to do it in a way that produces healthy incentives. If we have time at the end, we can talk about why bounties seem like a good idea and actually aren't. But boosting will let you do this, because the idea is that let's imagine this group is outside of Google. They go and buy a bunch of grain. Let's say they buy $30,000 worth of grain. So now they're a sponsor of the project. They can boost their feature request, which is the feature request to make TensorBoard support private information. And now that feature request is going to become worth a ton of cred. So that will incentivize me now to do exactly what I did do, which is prioritize fixing it. So the general flow is you have some need from the project, you boost the contributions that will solve your need, and then that creates more cred, which creates an incentive for everyone in the project to fix it for you. And the nice thing about this is like it's much better than like hiring a developer. If I want to hire a developer to go and fix a bug on an open source project, there's going to be so much overhead for that developer to even learn how the project works. You're paying huge friction costs, versus being able to seamlessly incentivize the people who are already working on the project to fix it for you. Now, boosting also defines a kind of prediction market on cred. Because remember, once you boost something, you get to take home a share of its future cred. So you could go and do this game of finding undervalued contributions, boosting them, and then as people realize that the contributions were undervalued, you're going to get more cred. And you could even do this as a kind of like arbitrage strategy. Like maybe I find a project that just really doesn't appreciate the importance of design. And so they have these people doing design work, like a little bit, but it's just not getting any reward, which kind of often happens. then you could go and say, okay, first, step one, I'm gonna boost all of the design work. Step two, I'm gonna go and get super loud and be like, y'all, what are you doing? Like, look at how important design is to this project. Look at how your weights are wrong. Here's how to change the weight so the design gets properly recognized. And if you make a good case, the project will want to improve their cred and will want to properly reward designers so that the project can succeed. And then you'll get cred for having like been the person who boosted up design. So taken together, we can kind of view boosting as a sort of decentralized management. It means that sponsors can help choose the direction and priorities for a project. If the sponsors do a good job, then they will earn cred. And then the sponsors can earn more grain. And if you think about what a manager does in a traditional company, they're given some amount of headcount, some amount of resources, some amount of budget, and they need to deploy those resources in a way that generates a return for the organization. But to be able to do this, you need to play political games, you need to get appointed by a manager above you, somewhere back to like the CEO or board of directors. Whereas with boosting, anyone can decide to sponsor a project, and anyone can thus help direct resources within the project in a way that will be effective. So this brings us to the cred experiment and to source cred itself. I think in general, it's very easy to design cool social systems in your head. I'm sure a lot of people in this room felt like, it would be great if like this would happen and this would happen, and it would be like a beautiful utopia. We'd all be working together, and like, you read a lot of science fiction books like this, and the issue is it's really hard to tell whether the cool ideas will actually work in reality, because reality is like phenomenally more complex than the model of it you have in your head. And so it was pretty important for source cred to be like, okay, we have these nice stories about why source cred won't get gamed and like catch on fire, but we need this to actually get tested. And it seems irresponsible to ask someone else to test our like totally untried incentive technology, given how much could go wrong when you're using these systems. So we've turned source cred on for source cred itself, and that's the cred experiment. Basically, we started doing this in October of last year, so it's about six-ish months of experience. So we're getting cred from GitHub. We've got 7 repos on GitHub, corresponds to about 11,000 nodes and 26,000 edges. And now we have cred scores for stuff like GitHub issues. So this issue to refactor so that PageRank runs in the background into 200 cred. This one for making source cred more robust on really large repositories is worth 106 cred. We also have a discourse forum where we are just discussing the protocol, trying to find ways to improve it, trying to work out the social situations in it. And this has got about 600 posts. Now that corresponds to about 4,000 nodes and 11,000 edges. And once again, every topic has got a cred score. So our highest cred post of all time is this About Champions and Heroes post, which kind of explores what does it mean to be a champion of something in an open source project. We've also got one about making a weight change to the algorithm, and another that's a piece of art. And these all have cred scores. And like if you look at this art thread, it actually is a thread that contains this really cool piece of art made by LB. And that got cred, call it art cred. And I think one of the things that people have really wondered about all of these sort of techno-utopian hacker compensation mechanisms is this going to have rewards for anything other than coding? Because oftentimes people are really just focusing on like developers. And I can say in the case of source cred that a large fraction of the reward is going to work like organizing the community, like inspiring people with art, like figuring out what kind of social practices will work well for using cred. For example, we've learned that it's good to focus on the cred of the contribution and not the cred of the contributor, because it's really easy to feel personally attacked if someone is saying, so-and-so's cred is too high, like that feels terrible, versus saying, pull requests are earning too much cred. That's like a little bit easier to have a polite conversation about. So we could take a little gander through source cred's own cred, why not? And here it is. So this chart here is showing us every week how much cred different contributors in the project have earned. So you can see in the beginning it was just me and William working on source cred. And then there was kind of a dip where we tried to figure out what to do with the project. And then around the time of the cred experiment, just really kicking off in August, we started to see a lot of different people start participating in the project. And it's now a much more diverse set of contributors. And then we can go and look and say, what are the GitHub issues that have lots of cred, and every single issue has a score? Or what are the discourse posts? And you know, it's oftentimes like the first post in like a really important topic will get a lot of cred. The other thing I'll note is that it's super easy to change the weights. We've got this whole like UI here where we can say, okay, you know, maybe we're valuing pull requests too highly, or maybe we really need more pull request reviews, and at this point we've got too many pull requests. And then you can just recompute how that would change the cred. And it actually just runs live in the browser, but it takes a little bit on large repositories. I'll give it a second. I didn't plan a live demo, there you go. So anyway, let's talk roadmap. So we've done a lot of the early work in proving out the system. We're able to generate graphs from a variety of data sources. We're able to compute cred on those graphs, and we're able to issue grain to people, although it's kind of hacky right now. We've got a number of things that we're still working on. We haven't yet implemented boosting, although that's a high priority that we're pretty excited about. We haven't yet made grain live on the blockchain. So right now we're just kind of like tracking it by hand in the Git repo. And we need to build a new UI. This UI I just showed you, it's like not, it's probably actually one of the oldest parts of the project. We want to build something that makes it a lot more intuitive to understand where cred is coming from, and also to reorient to see like, you know, what were the important contributions lately? Like what would earn a lot of cred prospectively? What are we valuing right now? And then in the further future, the thing we're also really excited about is setting up some meta cred instances. So the idea here is that once you have multiple projects using source cred, it would make a lot of sense to flow cred between them. So for example, source cred depends on Discourse, because we use that for hosting all of our discussions. And Discourse is itself an open source project. So we would love to flow some of our cred and some of our grain upstream. We think that's really the vital step for making the whole open source ecosystem sustainable and actually thriving. So that's something maybe like towards the end of the year or next year we'll start to get to work on. Right now we are looking for a couple beta pilot partners from other like DAO-ish, like crypto innovator type projects that have the same problems. Now that we've used SourceCred for about half a year on SourceCred, I feel confident actually being like, yeah, other people should like try this, you know, with caution, but try eating this dog food because we ate it for a long time, we didn't get too sick. So we're looking for 3 like pilot partners who want to try it out. You can read more on our Discourse and just kind of get a sense of what, you know, what the criteria are, what we're offering. And also I heard from Dan that the Crypto Rado community might be interested in using SourceCred, so throwing that plug out there. And if you want to get involved just in general, you could contribute, in which case checking out our Discord, which is, you know, chat and voice kind of thing. We have community calls every Tuesday, although we're not planning to have one this Tuesday just because everything is happening. You can check out our forum, which is where we have all these discussions, and you know, it's a great place to earn some cred. You could sponsor SourceCred. Right now it's all in fiat on Open Collective, but we'll have some crypto stuff coming later in the year. And you'll eventually get grain and be able to boost with it. And you can also beta test it, which is the same link as before. And I will end on this note of really cool, like, dark star SourceCred art. And I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes?
What do you think about what Handshake did?
Handshake was doing an airdrop across all of GitHub.
Okay, but how they contributed, the people that actually like made more contribution versus others?
I have no idea what they did.
I think they have a similar model. Cool.
Good
And
talk.
a second question, like, how the SourceCred, I mean, it's 2 things, right? It's shares for contribution, and it's also a governance token that enable people to vote, right?
Sort of. So I would say SourceCred is 2 things. One is a sort of reputation-esque score that is constantly updating based on how much value you've added to the project. And the other is tokens that give you governance rights. And the idea is that if you have a high score, you'll keep on earning more and more tokens that you can then use to change priorities in the project or can sell to sponsors.
And how it's really happening, like people are getting permissions on the GitHub account?
So right now, the way that it works, I can show you how the sausage is made, as it were. Right now, it's all just being stored in GitHub itself. So my computer's acting up with stuff like that. So basically, we have a Git repository that is tracking token balances, and every week I publish an update to that Git repository. So like in the week of February 2nd, we can see here like who had cred, both weekly cred and lifetime cred. I'm gonna zoom this in a little bit more. We can see who we were giving grain payouts to. So for example, like I got 6,000 grain in this week. And then you can also see the total grain balances across different contributors. Over time, we're going to migrate this to be less like, centralized on a particular GitHub account. But this was a good way to just like get things running initially. Yes.
Awesome work since August. I think this time was a lot has happened. Question about the communities. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys have seen in the communities, like how they build or how they're created, who's owning the community, like who's leading it?
So I would say that there's only one community using SourceCred right now,
okay.
which is SourceCred itself.
Got it.
We have right now a highly centralized governance model in that I'm the temporary benevolent dictator, and I get final say on like what the weights are in like controversial decisions. I think this has been a nice way to start. It's definitely, we want to like devolve more and more power away from me because it's not a good long-term solution. We've mostly seen people are like pretty happy to like come to consensus about trying to make the algorithm work really well and wanting everyone in the project to be fairly valued. We've had a couple moments of like controversy around changing weights. So at one point we realized we were just giving way too much cred for discourse posts compared to GitHub activity, and such that like a rational person would never want to code. They would just rather like write cool posts on the forum. So we shifted the weights down to reduce the credit discourse and kind of increase the credit pull requests, basically. And it's in the process of doing that, we like have learned a lot about, basically focus the discussion on the kind of work we want to reward and not on which particular people will be gaining or losing credit. Yes?
So you could consider not needing the weights because don't you use grain boosting?
Yes.
To decide how to allocate grain, and that's just like letting everyone use their own grain to decide for themselves.
Yep, that's super astute. I think right now we're the way that we mint cred, because source cred is mostly about figuring out how the cred should flow, but the cred needs to flow from somewhere in particular. Once we have boosting turned on, the cred will mostly be flowing from things that were boosted. But since we haven't built boosting, we kind of use these heuristics that are a little bit more fragile. So right now we're minting cred when someone likes something on discourse, that actually creates new cred. And when someone merges a pull request, that creates new cred. But we're going to move to a boosting system as we build it. Yes?
So you said you had some background in machine learning. Are you using genetic algorithms or any other ML techniques for like a social immune system kind of thing?
No, I think that like machine learning is a very sexy technology. Working on it for several years persuaded me there's really a lot of work to get proper machine learning things up and running. Since SourceCred is extremely pluggable, I expect that as the paradigm matures, people will start building really clever machine learning things that integrate and like create new subsections of the graph, maybe have new heuristics on how to value certain kinds of work. But for now, it's much higher leverage for us to focus on making the core algorithm and the core like economic system work really well, so that as people want to add fancy stuff like machine learning, they can do it later.
Yeah, because you have to have a model to tune to, so it makes sense to get that stuff right first.
Yeah, you need to have a good like labeled data set of which contributions were valuable, and those things don't really exist as of yet.
Cool.
Yes.
To piggyback off the need for a model, are you using, I know you work with Sargon a little bit, do you guys use CAD/CAD at all?
We don't use CAD/CAD in part because all of our work in all the algorithm right now is like under-documented JavaScript. We're actually working on formally like speccing the algorithm and producing a Python implementation. And so I think working with CAD/CAD will become a lot more feasible once you can actually hook into it from Python. Yes?
So how many open source projects are currently using SourceCred?
One.
Except the cred itself at this moment?
Yeah, there's one open source project using SourceCred and SourceCred itself.
So do you have any plan to convert and migrate any other
Yeah, so we've generally wanted to be really cautious and really intentional with this. I think that, like, from my perspective, the worst thing to happen would be, let's say that a really big community decides to use SourceCred. Let's say that they've got a lot of people who, let's call them like low trust or like highly rational actors. They're not aligned on like trying to ship the thing, they just like want to get their tokens fast. Like SourceCred will get to a point where it's mature enough to be used in those communities, but I wanna kind of like gradually deploy it to more and more communities. I would say for me, I really wanted to spend at least half a year testing SourceCred on itself before encouraging anyone else to use it, so that we could start ironing out the obvious flaws. We're just at a point right now where we want to get these beta pilot partners to start using SourceCred alongside us.
Actually, I run some similar things about 2 years ago. We use some kind of like a PageRank algorithm to voting to whose engineer is doing better than others, but it's running quite not well. So I wonder, how can I use SourceCred into our?
Well, if you want to like try it out, it's actually quite straightforward. If you go to SourceCred/SourceCred on GitHub, you can read the instructions, and you can actually you can run SourceCred on any GitHub repository you want. You just need to provide an API key, install SourceCred, and then just sort of like this exact command. You just run SourceCred load on the repo you're interested in. So we've shown cred scores to a lot of different projects, and the feedback that they give is generally that the scores seem like quite accurate and that they're giving cred to the right people. But it's, again, it's one thing to produce a cred score that is good before anyone was really interacting with the system. The question is how well it holds up once people are increasingly motivated by trying to increase their score. And that's why we've been pretty cautious in wanting to roll it out very intentionally with partner projects rather than just kind of scattershot, like throwing it at a lot of different communities.
Can I actually rephrase my question then?
Sure.
'Cause I think I understood it as, like, for example, you can have a temporary community, so when you kind of come together to work on a project, and that project's not necessarily long-term, or it can extend to long-term. It's about coordination and kind of immediacy there. So do you intend that it's for one or the other, like there's more larger long-term companies or communities, or that it could be used for these like smaller, like, Denver planning group, or kind of something that's more temporary?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about that dimension before. So far in my thinking about SourceCred, I've definitely been thinking about open source projects in particular, which tend to be very long running because they live as long as anyone's using or maintaining them. I would think that while the same techniques should apply to temporary communities, I think it'll probably be a little bit harder in some ways because you don't have as much social context and you also don't have as much data to work from. I think it'd be an interesting thing to experiment with, and as the paradigm matures, we'll definitely be able to solve that use case. Yes?
So you're saying something about, I think you're showing in your demo how you can back calculate all of this source code on a repo, and I was just wondering, obviously, I guess that maybe would get really computation intensive once these get really larger, like once you go back in time a long time. So what's your plan on doing with that?
Well, so I would say, there's a couple of things here. I will say that, for example, if you wanted to run SourceCred on Git or Linux or TensorFlow or a very large repository, it will be a pain. The pain is not mostly the computation. The pain is mostly getting the data out of GitHub. So doing a full load on TensorFlow probably takes what, like 8 hours, something like that. Yeah. So it tends to be more the data I/O rather than the compute that's the limit. It might be interesting to note that right now SourceCred is run, the way that SourceCred works is I run SourceCred on my own machine to generate scores, and I publish them, and anyone else could verify that the scores are correct. But right now it's not at all feasible to say run SourceCred on a blockchain because the gas cost would just be utterly prohibitive. But I think over time, because the cred distributions have the nice property that you can check correctness much more quickly than you can generate them. So I think it'll in time become feasible to actually have oracles publish cred distributions to a blockchain and then on-chain validate that the cred computation is correct, maybe in like a TrueBit kind of style.
I think you might have touched on this, but could you reiterate or address the collusion risk that's introduced by boosting?
Right. So the idea here is that, so the shortest collusion path is I could just boost myself all the time, right? So I take my grain and then I go and burn it to make myself more valuable, which causes me to get more grain. And it might be that we disallow boosting directly on individuals for social reasons, but then I could boost all my own contributions. I think this gets at actually what we were saying in terms of using CAD-CAD. Like as we start to build these cryptoeconomic systems, we're going to need to do a lot of modeling, and we're going to need to do kind of like threat analysis on the how much return do I get from trying to like boost my co-collaborators versus boost the genuinely valuable work. And I think that like basically this is like a research area is what I'm saying. I'll say one of the things I often like to think about though is when someone suggests an attack on the system, I ask myself, does this attack feel like an attack that already exists in the world? And if so, how effectively are social systems able to metabolize it? And it seems like people boosting their friends in like a reputation and credibility situation, like it happens a lot. It's like can be kind of gross when it happens, and we should probably build good tools to try to make this transparent so that it's easy for the community to see like, oh, okay, these two people, they're always boosting each other. Maybe as a community, we want to say that this is against our values, and then we're going to have like a system for moderating that, you know? But I think ultimately a lot of this comes back to the social layer rather than being handled purely at the algorithmic layer.
Okay.
And just to add to that, I mean, if you're starting with high trust level communities that care about the end goal and not making a profit, they're actually trying to value like the creation of something, and that's their highest altruistic motive, more than making money. This is just an incentive to keep that underlying thing going. They're not going to try to game the system. They just actually want to produce value.
Right. Yeah, that's essentially been my theory, is that I think that this is a system that could, when very well developed, work in low trust communities. But the way that we'll get it so robust that it works in low trust communities is by starting with high trust communities and then kind of going to like slightly larger and maybe medium trust communities. And in each step away, we'll learn how to make the system more robust.
Just to, I guess, add on to that, unless somebody else has a question.
Go for it.
Okay. So for high trust communities that are online, I mean, you have to rely on some strong form of identity, right? So.
Don't actually agree with that.
Okay, so what is is there a risk for people using their social credibility outside of a project or they could essentially impersonate somebody in a project that has a high trust outside of the project?
So let's consider the case of SourceGrid, right? We've had some pseudonymous contributors.
Okay.
So we only know them by the username that shows in Discourse.
Okay.
But the fact that we don't have any like real identity for them doesn't matter because, you know, we know who they are. They've like written tons of posts. They've sent people private messages. We kind of know like what they're about.
Okay.
And so I think that's the sense in which like strong identity is not actually needed, because you can almost think of it as like there's a proof of work in creating an identity. If you create a random new user account on Discourse, even if you create a username that looks like the username of a famous person, you're not going to have a lot of cred. The way you get cred is by making a ton of posts that other people liked, making a ton of pull requests that got merged. And that's an expensive process.
Right, so but when they joined, it was low trust until they earned some higher level of trust, I guess.
Yeah, I would say SourceCred is a high trust community in the sense that there's a relatively small number of people who are really actively involved in the system, and they all know each other, and they're all kind of like pushing for the system to be successful rather than to like get as much as they can personally. Now, if we were to look at a much larger community, let's say in like 3 years, like right now I can tell you off the top of my head who all the top SourceCred contributors are. And if one of them started really gaming the algorithm, I would send them a message and be like, hey, I see that you got more cred than everyone else this week. It's because you did this and this, and I can see it. And I'm gonna ask you to stop. And if you don't do this, then we're gonna have to make a change to the weight. So we're gonna have to add a patch because this is not working as intended. Now, once SourceCred is, say, 2 orders of magnitude larger, now instead of maybe like 10 super engaged contributors, there are 1,000 super engaged contributors. I'm no longer going to have that social visibility into what everyone is doing. And so the algorithm needs to kind of be more robust at that point because there's not as much context, like social cohesion to catch it.
But can't your own community create a governance system in which you decide on that? Like,
Yep.
like a MakerBit is polling or something, right? So.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of what boosting will do, because boosting becomes a decentralized mechanism for valuing contributions, which makes it a lot. It's sort of the issue that we did see was, as I mentioned, when we were minting a lot of cred for every discourse topic. And so the result was, if I went and made 10 discourse topics and they all got no views and no likes, you would still just get a bunch of cred without any community review. So the way we kind of tweaked that was to say, okay, now we're going to mint cred, not for the act of writing a topic, but for the act of getting a like on your poster topic. So now all cred is being minted based on someone else in the community having checked out on it. Now, in the future, we'll probably have a situation where people will just make spam discourse accounts and use those like discourse accounts to like stuff. And sure, we can like play with that on the edges, but we're going to migrate into boosting, because then to mint cred, you actually have to like commit some scarce resource, and that's where I think we start to get good guarantees against gaming, as opposed to just like hoping we'll stay one step ahead of all the mice. Yes.
What kind of applications you imagine that source code would be the best for?
I think right now it is absolutely the best thing for distributing tokens in genuinely decentralized projects, where you don't want to have some like CEO who's deciding how much everyone gets paid. And I say it's generally the best because I really think, like we talked at the beginning before my talk about the different ways to do it. You could do it based on number of certain kinds of activity. You could do it based on like subjective ratings. And SourceCred is kind of the union of this. It's like we track all the activities, you have the data, and you track the subjective ratings, so you have the human input, but it's being fused together in a system that can then grow and accommodate more and more improvements, rather than being kind of like an endpoint in itself. I think that as SourceCred matures, it will increasingly build an economic system for open source projects in general, and that's going to lead to open source thriving in a way that is really paradigm shifting. I think open source is ultimately going to replace corporate capitalism, because for things, open networks are simply more valuable than like closed proprietary technology, because it's valuable for everyone in the world to be able to find ways to improve it, and it's valuable for everyone in the world to be able to find ways to deploy it. And so I think the ultimate vision that I see is a world where essentially everything has been made open source, where pharmaceutical drug development is open source, where designs where you can 3D print anything you want, because the designs for all of the world's basic infrastructure has been open sourced. And that's ultimately what I hope to see, this small beginning of distributing tokens and DAOs to eventually lead to an economy that works a lot better for people. It's actually 4:59. I'm gonna end on time on that like big inspiring note, but I'm happy to talk to people after.